Hi guys, I'm Ali. I'm a freelance filmmaker, director and content creator. Over the last 18 months or so, I've worked with Panasonic in the UK with their Panasonic Lumix GH5. So I'm really excited to bring you my complete guide for the camera. I hope this helps you master the GH5 and perhaps future Lumix cameras. I'll go through everything about this camera, including features, specs, and my personal workflow. I'll cover things from a beginner level all the way to advanced, so there is value for everyone watching this. Chances are that you've bought this camera to use mainly for video applications, so that's what I'll be focusing on. I'll start with the camera overview, going through the buttons, the dials, before going into exposure, drive modes, ISO, white balance, quick menu, and photo styles. Of course, I'll also cover frame rates, video resolution, and the vlog upgrade. I will then go through audio recording and how I use manual focus before finally sharing my personal configuration and how I like to use the camera. I think you'll really enjoy this, so yeah, let's just jump in. This camera is packed with features, and I think that's what makes it, at least in my opinion, great value for money, even now in 2018. Let's jump into the body and go through the buttons and the dials. You've got the first dial on the left hand side, which has your single shutter to multiple shutter mode and other modes like the self timer and the time-lapse mode. On the other side we have the PASM dial for program, aperture, shutter and manual exposure. This dial is also how you get into the creative mode, so you have the creative movie mode here and your other customized modes, C1, C2 and C3. In between the two dials we have our hot shoe mount. This is where you connect your flash and microphone and other audio accessories. On the right hand side we have our shutter release button. Behind that directly, the first dial that we have, this one is by default set to change the aperture. The red button here allows you to record video in any, regardless of the mode you're in, so even if you're in the stills mode, you can hit that button and it starts recording video, which is great if you want to quickly shoot video without having to change anything. It happened to me a few times where I'm taking stills and realize actually I need to take video, so I just hit that and it starts recording. On the left hand side we have the playback button. This obviously plays back your footage and video. On top of that we have the function 5 button, or the LVF, which basically allows you to toggle for viewing through the viewfinder or the LCD, depending on what you prefer at the time. Over here we have a switch that allows you to change from autofocus single to autofocus continuous and manual focus, as well as having a button inside that which allows you to manually trigger focus if you're in a manual focus mode or do an exposure lock. The dial at the back is our shutter speed dial. Then if we move down here we have our function 2 button, which we use to access the quick menu. I find this very useful. And then below that we have the function 3 and function 4, which both can be used to anything that you want. You can basically customize these to access a certain option in the menu, and I find these great. And then on the right hand side you have the display button, which allows you to toggle on and off the shooting information. So this is useful if you've adjusted all your settings and you want to kind of just remove them from the frame, so you can just focus on framing. This is great to have off. And then if you press it a third time, actually the display button goes into the LVF. The joystick basically allows you to change your focus point or move it around, and then you can even set this to a certain function if you want, so you can customize it to do something else. Underneath that is another dial which can be spun or clicked. And there's a menu button in the middle. This is our LCD, which is a complete flip out screen. You can move it in almost any direction you want. This is something that I love about the GH5. And once you shoot with a camera that can do this, it's really hard to go back to a camera that can't, because you find this so useful in so many shooting situations. So for example, if I'm shooting bottom up and I don't want to sort of attract attention to myself, I can do this. If I'm doing a selfie, I can do that. If I'm shooting from the top, I can do this. So many different positions that you can put this in. On the other side, we have the dual SD card slots. This allows you to record video to one card and stills to the other card, or have them both record at the same time. So you can have a copy, or you can use continuous recording, where if one SD card fills up, then the recording continues on the second SD card. I love this feature, and again, it's really useful if you're shooting for a long period of time. On the bottom, you have your battery door, and next to it, you have a hidden sort of door for your GH5 adapter. So this comes off, and then you have that here. On the left side, you have your ports. So you have your microphone input here, then your headphone jack, HDMI, full HDMI output, and the USB-C port. And then before I forget, you have your white balance, ISO, and exposure compensation all here next to your recording button and shutter button. So that's the GH5 camera body. One of the reasons I love shooting mirrorless is the fact that you have a live view. It shows you exactly what the camera is going to capture. And this is something that you don't have in your typical DSLR. And the live viewfinder is simply here, and we can, as soon as you get your GH5, you'll have the eye sensor switched on. And basically what that does, if let's say you're viewing on your LCD and you bring it up to your eye level, the view will automatically go from your LCD to your viewfinder. I personally have the eye sensor, which is over here, by the way. I have it switched off because I find it quite annoying. And to do so, you go into your menu settings and then go into page 2 of 4, and then you can see that you can change the sensitivity of the eye sensor. You can go from high to low, and you can also change the monitor switch from your LVF. I have it on the monitor, and then if I am in a situation where maybe I'm outside and it's really sunny and I can't see the LCD and I want to look through the viewfinder, I just hit my live viewfinder button, and that switches to the live viewfinder, and then I can see it through here. Okay guys, let's go through the mode dial. The mode dial essentially allows you to switch between stills, photography, video, and fully automatic modes. And if we go through them one by one, we have the program mode, aperture priority, S for shutter, then manual, fully manual mode, creative movie, and then you have your 3 custom modes, custom 1, 2, and 3. Then we have our art mode, and then intelligent auto mode. If you're very new to this, by the way, image exposure is made up of 3 components. You have your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So you need to control these in order to get the right exposure for every image or scene that you're capturing. So program mode is fully automatic, so the camera decides both the aperture for you and the speed, the shutter speed. So this is a mode that you would get into if you probably have no idea what to do. I never really use program mode. I just don't trust cameras, but it's just something to be aware of. Aperture priority is when, as the name suggests, you set the aperture and the camera adjusts the shutter speed based on the scene and the environment. You can obviously set your ISO to the levels that you want in these modes, or you can have it on auto ISO. I personally never really use auto ISO. I just adjust it manually. I find that a lot better than having to put it on auto ISO. But we'll go through ISO in detail in a different section. So then you have your shutter priority mode, again, where you set the shutter speed and then the camera decides the aperture for you. Then fully manual mode, you choose both. Shutter and the aperture fully, in control of that. Then you have your creative movie mode, and this is where you access sort of all the features for the video. This is the feature that you want to be on when you're shooting video. Then the customs, like I said, you can set these to anything you want. Then we have the art mode. Art mode is essentially sort of baked in looks or filters. It's probably not a good idea to shoot JPEGs when you're shooting in photo in sort of art mode, because the looks will be baked in and you'll never be able to change them. So if you are using the art mode, I'd probably suggest shooting in RAW as well as JPEG. So in case you don't like that look later, you have the option of changing that. Intelligent auto is very interesting. It's basically, let's say you are on holiday and you give the camera to someone who has no idea what to do with it, and you want them to take your picture, your portrait, the camera will actually recognize that you're taking a portrait. So there is some sort of algorithm that's happening in the software that decides that, actually this is a portrait. And then if you point it at a flower, it'll recognize that it's a flower. You point it at a sunset, it'll realize it's a sunset, and so on. Again, like I say, this is a good thing, good mode to shoot on if you're handing the camera to someone that has no idea what to do with the camera. I shoot in aperture priority a lot when I'm shooting time lapses and hyperlapses, especially if I know that the lighting is going to change dramatically. So if I'm shooting a time lapse or a hyperlapse at sunset or sunrise, I will probably shoot on aperture priority because I know that the lighting is going to change dramatically so quickly and I won't be able to keep up with it. But if I know that the lighting is consistent and it's not going to change much, then I just stick to manual and I choose everything myself, so the camera doesn't change anything. Okay guys, let's talk about white balance. To access your white balance, you simply press the button for white balance, WB at the top, and then you access all the options for your white balance. Now, in my opinion, I think it's really important to get your white balance right in camera, so you don't have to do any adjustments in post. And there are a couple of ways you can do that. Auto white balance is usually actually very good, and I tend to shoot a lot of my films or videos on auto white balance, but sometimes it's not really the best thing, because if you go from one environment that's lit in a certain light into a different room or a different area, then the white balance might actually change, and you can see that changing. And also if you're shooting travel videos, if you point at the sky and then you point at something green or at the landscape, it might actually change, and you might see that in the shot, so that's not always good. Now, to get my white balance right, I use something neutral to do that, so either a grey card or a white card, but usually a grey card is ideal for what I do, and it doesn't absorb any sort of color cast. To do this, I'm going to show you using this sort of basic grey card, which is basically on the back of a magazine, but I usually take a small one with me on set. And what you do is you basically go into your Kelvin mode. So I'm going to go into the mode 1 here, the custom mode 1 here, and then if you go to select white balance, and what you do is basically you point the camera at the grey card and then you press set. Now you could hear the camera actually taking a shot, and it sounds like it's taking a picture, but it's not actually taking a picture. What it's done is basically corrected the white balance, and now that white balance is set, and you know that you've done it right and it's not going to change throughout the shoot. So that's great. What you can do also is you can add certain tones to your white balance by going into adjust of any really mode, and then you can maybe add a teal sort of color to the shadows, or any color that you want. I genuinely don't really touch these, because if I feel like I want to add any different tones, then I just do it in post. So I tend to carry one of these in my backpack wherever I go. I just pull it out and just use the grey card, set up my white balance, and I'm good to go. If I don't have enough time to do that, then I'm usually happy with auto white balance, and usually it does a very decent job. Okay guys, so let's talk about ISO next. Now the ISO range on the GH5 ranges from a low 100 all the way to a maximum of 25600. Now, if you're in video mode, it actually drops down to 12,800 ISO. So generally speaking, I don't really shoot anything above 1600. I sometimes do push it to like maybe 2500, 3200, but that's it. I don't really go above that, because then you start introducing noise, and I know if I shoot anything above 1600, I'm going to have to apply some sort of noise reduction. If we go into ISO, you can see all these different ranges. I've done them in increments of a third, and to do that you simply go into the menu, exposure settings I believe, and then you go to extend it, and then you go to ISO increments and you choose thirds of a stop. Obviously you also have your auto ISO, and I genuinely don't really use auto ISO, but you can use it if you know you're gonna need that. Personally, I'd prefer to change it myself, It can be useful if you're doing a shoot where you go from like an outdoors location to an indoors location. Now we can set the upper limit of the GH5's ISO sensitivity, and to do that we go into the creative video menu and we go to page 2 of 4, and then we go to ISO sensitivity video, and then we can set the minimum sort of auto ISO limit setting to 200, and then the upper limit to 1600, and this is what I have it set on. So in this mode the camera wouldn't go above 1600, and that's basically how to set up the ISO. Now moving on to exposure compensation. This is useful when you're in stills mode. This basically means that the camera can adjust the exposure and make it darker or brighter, and you can see you can make it darker by 5 stops or brighter by 5 stops. And again, this is useful when you're doing stills photography. We can start talking about the photo styles of the camera. The photo styles is basically really important when you're shooting video, even though it applies to both video and stills. But with stills, you have the option of obviously shooting raw, and you get a lot more information with raw. But with video, we can't really do that. Not on this camera anyway, at this price range. Standard is just standard, that's just your standard color. You don't really, if you don't really want to do any sort of adjustments in post. Then we have vivid, which I never really use, but this might be great if you really want some sort of vivid colors in your image, and landscape maybe. And then natural. Natural is probably the most neutral profile, and I have mine slightly adjusted. And by the way, you can customize these in any way you want. So for me, I have my neutral profile, which I do a lot of my client work with. So I have my contrast set to -1, my sharpness set to -2, noise reduction to -1, and then my saturation to -1, and then I leave the hue left as it is. I've just found that profile to work best for me, so you don't have to follow these, but I'm just sort of letting you know. Then we have monochrome, L monochrome, which is sort of more contrasty, and scenery, portrait, and then we have our custom modes, and we can adjust these in any way we want. And then we have Cinelike D. I love shooting in Cine D because it gives me a bit more room in post to adjust colors and apply LUTs, and I shoot a lot of my videos on Cinelike D. It's flat, but it's not the flattest on the profile. Then we have Cinelike V, which is basically a bit more contrasty than Cinelike D, and it has so it basically requires less grading in post, and I rarely really shoot in Cinelike V, but it's there if you need it. And then we have Like 709. Now Like 709 gives you a nice roll off of the highlights, and it doesn't require much grading, but again, it's not something that I really use, but it's there if you need it. And then we have Vlog L, and this is the paid upgrade that you have to buy from Panasonic, so you can add it to the GH5. And this is basically the profile that gives you the highest dynamic range, so it gives you an additional 2 stops of dynamic range. So this will require a fair bit of grading, because you need to bring back the highlights and the shadows and add contrast and saturation, etc. So we'll talk about this in a different module. But it's really important in video to know exactly your sort of workflow. For me, I usually, for client work anyway, I don't really have much time to do any grading, if any, right? So I shoot a lot on my natural profile, and I shoot a lot on my Cinelike D, because then I have my own LUT that I just apply on the footage and it's ready to go, so it's fairly quick. But if I had more time and I had a specific look that I was after, and I wanted as much information to capture on the sensor so I can grade in post, I'll probably shoot Vlog. Okay guys, next let's talk about the quick menu. The quick menu, as the name suggests, it's a quick way to get into certain functions that you want depending on the mode that you're in. So if we go into the quick menu and we press the button for quick menu, or the function 2, you can see that I've set up my photo styles at the top, which is by default how it is anyway. And then at the bottom I have my VFR, my focus speaker, and my recording sort of quality, and then my stabilisation. This is basically the page that I use the most. This can be really useful to sort of change your photo styles quickly, or change your recording format. Okay guys, next we're going to talk about the video features of this camera, and this camera is packed with video features. So let's start with the recording formats. This camera has 4 recording formats. You have AV-CHD, which is best for playing back footage on a TV. So if you plug a HDMI cable into the camera and then the other end into the TV, then this format would probably be the best for that. But if you're going to do any editing, I'd probably stay away from this format. Then we have our MP4 and MOV recording formats. Basically, the difference between MP4 and MOV is essentially how the content is presented to your computer. So I personally do everything in MOV, and I find this is generally good for almost anything really. So let's start with the lowest sort of resolution that this camera can do, which is basically 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels long. Next you see the frame rate next to that, which at the moment is set to 24p, and that's basically the number of frames per second that the camera is shooting. So 24 frames per second is set to be basically the cinema standard, and that's what I tend to shoot in. We can either shoot in NTSC or PAL, depending on sort of what area you're in the world, but NTSC standard is 29.97, also referred to as 30p, which is basically the same thing, but this is the television frame rate. So in the cinema, the standard is 24 frames per second. So when you go from 24p or 25p to 29 or 30p, things look a little bit smoother probably. Some people sort of don't really like that, and some people do. I personally prefer shooting in 24p or 25p, and that's just my preference. Okay, so I currently have the camera set up to a system frequency of NTSC, and if you're shooting NTSC and you want that film look, then you want to shoot at 24p. For broadcast, you can't really shoot at 24p, so you need something closer to the variant of 29.97, and if we divide 29.97 by 1.25, this gives us a 23.976, and we round that up to 23.98. Anyway, that's not the point. Okay, so one of the great things about the GH5 is that it can record 422 10-bit internally, and you can choose between 420 and 422. 422 is obviously much better, and the difference between sort of 8-bit and 10-bit is a lot, even though it doesn't sound like much. I've done this before, I've come here, so I think that's 64 times the colors we had before. Okay, so 422 gives us better color and 10-bit gives us lots of these colors. Now 422 10-bit files are bigger and require probably more power and more time to edit. So if you don't need them, obviously 8-bit is just fine, but that's just something to keep in mind. And obviously as a filmmaker or a videographer, this is a business at the end of the day, so we need to work out how much time we have, if we have the budget to spend more time in post-production or not. So sometimes for a lot of my smaller budget shoots, I just stick to 8-bit, and most of the time 1080 actually, so I can get home and deliver that as soon as I can. 100 megabits per second is basically, as the name suggests, is the number of megabits per second that the camera can record on the GH5, and the GH5 can actually go up to, if we go all the way to the top here, it can go up to 400 megabits per second. Basically, the higher the megabits per second, the less compression we have and the better the quality of the footage will be. If we scroll up here and we go to where it says VFR available, here you can see that we have our variable frame rate, and this is where we can do slow motion. So if I select that option and then go into the video menu and go to variable frame rate and go to on, and then I can set that to up to 180 frames per second, and this is great. It means you can really slow down your footage, or if you want, you can go the other way and basically record really fast footage. Now the GH5 can record internally 4K up to 60 frames per second in 8-bit, and what that means is basically you can record twice as much of the footage, and you can slow it down to 50% in post, and you'll get smooth looking slow motion. And you also lose a bit of sharpness when you are shooting in really high frame rates. So if you're going above 60 frames per second, then you start losing a bit of that. Now, in terms of 4K 60p, you can't record internally in 10-bit, but you can record 60p 10-bit externally via the HDMI output to an external recorder like the Atomos Inferno. But again, you're going to be spending like £1,000 on that. So obviously that's just something to consider. Then we have the Cinema 4K options at the top, and these are basically our true Cinema 4K sort of resolutions, and that's 4096 wide by 2160 long. So it's the same height, but it's a little bit wider, almost 2:1, and this is basically the more cinematic and true 4K look. For a lot of my shoots, I actually shoot in PAL, so I shoot in 4K 50p for a lot of my stuff, and what that means, basically it means I can slow down my footage, any part of the footage that I've captured, to 50% and still keep that keep the sound and keep really nice quality. If I know that I'm going to be doing a lot of color correction or color grading in post, then obviously I choose 10-bit, and I either shoot in Cine-D or Vlog, again depending on how much time I have. A lot of the clients that I'm working with, and I have been working with over the last 3 years, I've only had one client who sort of consistently asked me for 4K footage. The majority, so all the rest of my clients, they're just happy with 1080p, they're just happy with full HD. They probably don't even know the difference between 4K and 1080p. Obviously 4K files are going to be bigger, and that's going to take you longer to edit, and it's going to require more storage, and more storage obviously means you're going to end up buying more hard drives and things like that, and it can get, you know, sort of expensive filming everything in 4K. But it can be worth it, because obviously 4K gives you the more of an image to more on the frame to crop in and zoom, sort of reframe, perhaps, you know, do a different angle, or, you know, do a zoom in, zoom out. It's just going to look a lot smoother, and it's just going to make it look like you have different cameras. You have a lot of cameras, which means you have high production value. So yeah, these are the advantages of 4K, and like I said, the camera is packed with these sort of recording qualities and video features that it just makes it, you know, a real pleasure shooting with. Okay guys, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was the digital teleconversion that we have on the GH5. This is not a digital zoom, this is an actual digital conversion where you actually get a bit of an extra reach, pretty much like a free lens on the GH5. And the way this works is that the GH5 has a sensor that has nearly 5,000 pixels. So instead of using the 4,000 plus pixels wide, it uses just the 3,840 pixels wide if we are shooting Ultra HD. So now we're still using a 1 pixel capture and delivery in 1 pixel output. You don't lose any quality. And this is a feature that I love, and it actually helped me in a lot of situations where I needed an extra reach. And to get into this mode, we go into the motion picture menu, and then we go to page 3 of 4, and then you can see that the teleconversion option here, and then if we press that, you have the on and off. So at the moment this is the frame that I have, and if I want to basically get that extra reach, what I do is I go into the menu and go into my teleconversion mode and switch that to on. And then what happens is that when you switch to HD, you get even more of a crop, and you're still not losing quality. So this is great. And then to do this, I'm basically just going to change the recording quality to full HD, and you can see that I've actually cropped in a lot more, and this is great. Very, very useful feature. Okay guys, next I wanted to talk about Vlog. I get a lot of questions about Vlog, so finally I get to explain it in a video, and I'm going to try to do this in the simplest way possible. Vlog is basically our flattest profile on the GH5. It gives us an extra 2 stops of dynamic range, and what that means is basically we are capturing more information and data in the shadows and the highlights. When shooting in a normal profile like Cine or natural profile, what the camera is doing is basically applying a gamma curve, and what that does is basically making the shadows darker and the highlights brighter. And this is great because the image looks great straight out of camera and you don't need to do much grading. You know, it looks great straight out of camera and you don't really need to do much. But what we are doing is basically losing all the, details or the data in the shadows and the highlights when it's being crushed using that gamma curve. So this is when Vlog comes in. Vlog basically keeps that data and it gives it to you so you can do the edit. The way to expose for Vlog is slightly different than when we are exposing for the other profiles, Cine, natural profile, and etc. We have to basically expose for the highlights, because generally speaking, if we expose for the highlights and when we go to the edit room, we can basically crush the shadows instead of bringing them up and introducing noise. So we crush the shadows and that gives us a cleaner image. So that's why we expose for the highlights. And when I basically expose for my natural profile and Cine, and by the way guys, this is just my way of doing it, so I'm sure other people will have different ways, but this is just how I do it and how I found it to be sort of the easiest and the sort of quickest and most intuitive way to expose. When I'm shooting in my natural profiles and Cine, I like to use the histogram, and it's quite simple. If I go into my creative movie mode, I've got the histogram already on display, and you can find that in the menu. You can switch that on, and I actually have it on all the time. So basically when the histogram is in yellow, it means that you don't have the right exposure. It needs to go to white, and that means you are in the right exposure. Obviously when you are shooting against the sun or when you are sort of shooting backlit, you need to be conscious that the camera might not get this right all the time. So you might need to use your eye for situations like that. So this is fine to shoot when you're like in a normal standard profile. Now if we go into our Vlog L, this is where I like to use my waveform. So with the waveform, basically, instead of on the histogram you see the image from left to right, on the waveform you see it bottom to top. So the bottom is our basically darker areas and the top is our whites and or highlights. Where the line bends on the waveform basically means that the lighting isn't even across the frame. So if it's going up, it means we are basically have more light on that side, and if it goes down, it means we have less light on the other side. The easiest way, again, that I've found to be quick to remember, and it's not very confusing until you get to used to the waveform, is to use the exposure compensation sort of meter at the bottom here. And what that does, it basically tells you where the right exposure is, or at least where the camera thinks the right exposure is. Once I've found that, I like to overexpose by 2 stops. So now it's at 0, I'm going to go 1, 2, and now I've overexposed by 2 stops. So I've lifted basically the shadows so I can have more information there. Okay guys, next we're going to talk about the audio recording on the GH5. Now the GH5 has 2 built-in microphones, tiny ones at the front in between the 2 dials, and the sound that you get from these isn't the best quality, so I don't really recommend you rely on these for your professional shoots. I personally have a shotgun microphone, a lav mic, and other audio accessories that I tend to use for my professional shoots. If we go into the audio options on the GH5, if you go to motion picture menu and then go to page 3 of 4, you'll see that you'll have 4 options here. We have the mic level display, and this basically allows us to see the levels of the audio going in the camera, and it basically ensures or shows you if you are peaking when it goes red. And then underneath that we have the mic level adjust, and basically this allows us to control the preamps that are in the GH5, and you can see that we have a range from -12 all the way to +6. But at the moment you can see that however loud I get, I'm not actually peaking, and that's because I have the mic level limiter on. And this feature is great because it basically means that the GH5 is always listening to the sound around you, and it's ensuring that whenever it's too high, it actually scales it back down so you don't peak. But if we switch that off and go back into the mic level adjust, and if we start from 0 dB, we can actually see that I'm peaking now. So if I bring this down to, let's say, -6, you can see I'm no longer peaking and it's actually usable sound. So I set this to -6, go back to my mic level limiter, and then switch that back on to ensure that I never peak. Now, we also have the wind noise canceller underneath that, and basically this reduces the sound of the wind coming in, and you have a high level, standard level, and off. I sometimes have it on high if I know that it's going to be really windy out there and I don't have a dead cat, and that's the basically a hardware piece that you put on your external microphone. I actually prefer the dead cat. I prefer a hardware piece than relying on the sort of built-in software wind cancellation. It's going to give you cleaner sound overall. I always carry with me my headphones to ensure that I'm listening to the audio coming in and making sure that it's sounding okay and I'm not sort of peaking. I also prefer using the preamps on the external mics than the preamps that are built in the camera. I feel that this will give you the cleaner quality when doing that. And if I know that I'm shooting in a very loud and sort of windy environment, I always have a dead cat on. And let's say if I'm shooting a live show or a festival, then I have the preamps that are built in the microphone, so I can adjust this to -10 or +20 and monitor it with the headphones. And that's essentially how you record audio on the GH5. Right, you guys, we are approaching the end of this guide. A few more things I wanted to talk about. The first thing is autofocus. I don't really use autofocus on the GH5, so I'm not really gonna go through that. It's just something that I don't really rely on. I do know that the autofocus has improved with the new firmwares, but I just never use it. I do use manual focus, however, quite a bit, and I rely on focus peaking to ensure that I get this right all the time. And to get into your focus peaking options, you go into the custom menu and go to monitor display, which is page 4 of 6, and go to peaking. You'll see that we have on, off, and set. I usually always have it on, and I set this to high and a display color of blue. Sometimes I do use low and use a color of red. So again, it depends on your preference. I like to use blue a lot, and blue usually stands out quite a bit, and red also. The next thing I wanted to talk about was stabilization. The GH5 comes with built-in body stabilization, so the sensor's actually stabilized, and if you combine it with a stabilized lens like the 12-35 f2.8 Mark II lens, you get dual stabilization. So you're having stabilization on the GH5 body and the lens. And this is amazing. It's actually saved me so many times on my shoots. Only last week I did a shoot for a singer, and she was having her first sort of headline show, and the space was so tight and I couldn't really get a tripod in there, so I had to go handheld. And just by holding up the camera above the crowd, I managed to get really stabilized footage. To get into the stabilizer option on the GH5, we go into the motion picture menu and then go to page 3 of 4. You'll see the stabilizer option at the top, and you'll see that you'll have a few options. If I go into this operation mode, you have left to right when you're in stills mode, and this is basically if you move left to right quite a bit. I like to have this one on and not the up and down motion, because I do notice that I do go left and right quite a bit. I always have my E-stabilization off because it does add a bit of a strange warping effect. IS lock video, this is incredible. This is the mode that replicates the tripod sort of shooting. I think it's great, and it does an amazing job of keeping your footage stabilized. You do want to be careful though when you are in IS lock mode, not to pan too quickly or do too much panning, because it can again warp the footage and make it look a bit strange. A bit of moving left and right is absolutely fine, but if you're doing it sort of quickly, it will start to look strange. So just keep that in mind. If you know you're going to do a lot of panning, just have this off and it'll look a lot more natural than having the IS lock on. The IS lock is just going to warp everything and it's just going to look really unnatural. Okay guys, so the next thing I wanted to talk about my personal configuration, and I get a lot of questions about this, so I'm giving you everything in this video. I essentially always have my video guideline on, and this basically enables me to see the video guideline where I can put the cinema bars, the black bars at the top and bottom of the frame. And I like to set this to 2.39 to 1 ratio. And I also like to have my guideline on the second option, which basically is very similar to the rule of thirds kind of composition, but it has a center marker and it has lots of intersections that I get to use when I'm doing my time lapses and hyperlapses. I always like to have my histogram on. Like I said before, this helps me to ensure that I basically get my exposure right every time. And I always like to have my mic level display on to ensure that I'm not peaking and I can monitor what's coming out of the camera. And then finally, I have my custom 1, 2, and 3 set to different settings. I have my custom 1 set to Cinelight D 4K 50p 8-bit. I have my custom 2 set to natural profile 4K 50p 8-bit. And finally, my custom 3 settings are set to Vlog L and 4K 150 megabits per second 422 10-bit with the waveform on. And if I need to switch off the waveform, I can just open my function buttons and get rid of that. I also have my LUTs, and I can switch from my LUT display to no LUT. Okay guys, this brings me to the end of the guide. I hope it brings you value. It's taken me a few days to put together. As you can see, I look different at the end of the video because I'm shooting this on a different day. If you do have any questions, put them in the comments down below and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. I'll see you in the next one.